Go.
Hello, good evening, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. And it's what date are we on today? The 1st of December, and it's just gone 8 o'clock. We're here with William Gairdner. He's here to join us again for another in the series on his books. Today, we're going to be discussing Gnosticism, and as always, Wovenut is our host. So I'll hand over to William now. Thank you very much once again for joining us, and over to you, sir.
Uh, Thank you very much for having me once again. I want to preface my remarks by saying, please fire me if you get sick of listening to me. Uh, I do enjoy these sessions, but I don't want to overstay my welcome.
It's not going to
So,
happen. You're
okay,
always
good.
welcome.
Thank you, sir. At any rate, um, so Gnosticism happens to be a topic that interests me a great deal. I began to get interested in it through a kind of serendipity over 20 years ago when I started asking myself questions about democracy and how modern democracy came to be, especially in my own country, Canada, but also in the United States and other countries of Europe. And that got me into the topic of Gnosticism, and I can explain a little later how that happened and where that took me, which was to some interesting places. But for now, let's just dwell upon the name Gnosticism and the topic. In the briefest of histories, and I take a lot of my learning from people like Norman Cohn and other writers on Gnosticism like Hans Jonas, who wrote wonderful books. And maybe I should show your viewers some of those. This is a fabulous book by Hans Jonas called The Gnostic Religion. Jonas was one of those extraordinary intellectuals whose interests were far and wide and deep. He was a student of Martin Heidegger, along with Karl Lowith, Hannah Arendt, and a number of other they were all mostly Jewish students of his who loved him and his teaching, even though he became a member of the Nazi Party, which strikes most of us as rather peculiar because we weren't there and we don't know what he was thinking at the time. And I think he joined up when it was in its euphoric mode, promising the kingdom of heaven on earth. And that's a phrase I'm going to get to in this talk eventually. So Heidegger joined up and never apologized for that after the war. Of course, he deplored the terrible things that came out of the Nazi movement, but he didn't deplore the harmony and social peace and egalitarian kingdom of heaven that Hitler was promising when he first came to power. That was why he joined. And it's distressing to think that this amazing intellectual used to finish every one of his lectures with a Heil Hitler salute in the classroom, and that he became a lover of Hannah Arendt, who was one of the brightest intellectuals you could hope to meet. She wrote a wonderful book called The Human Condition, and another one on totalitarianism. I forget the title, but perhaps the most jarring message of her book, as far as I can tell, was that totalitarianism is not something unusual or unique in the world, and ordinary people fall into this mode of thinking, not just big-time political theorists. And I will come around to this in a bit. So much for Hans Jonas. And the next book I read was also by a German named Kurt Rudolph. This is called The Nature and History of Gnosticism. It's a little less intellectually profound, but very wide and far-ranging, takes you back into the Zoroastrian religion of Iran, which really got its beginning about 1500 BC. And I'll just say something about that. It was focused on something that the Zoroastrians called the transformation of the righteous, a phrase we should keep in mind, because we hear something like that with modern evangelical Christians walking around my neighborhood who talk about and are concerned about whether or not you've been saved, which is the phrase they use. They consider themselves to have been saved by their belief in Christ and whatever else comes along with their type of religion. But it's not that far distant from what Zoroaster was talking about over 3,000 years ago. There are also Gnostic sects alive today. The Mandaeans, for example, which also got their start in Iran, are still practicing somewhere. And even my city, Toronto, which is a city of 3 million people, has a Gnostic church. And I actually tried to call them to ask them a little bit about their beliefs before this lecture, but nobody answered. Maybe that tells us something, and you'll see why I'm laughing too. Because maybe they got transported into the extra mundane realm beyond the earth where they were saved, and that's why they couldn't answer. At any rate, the roots of modern Gnosticism are very old, and I'm going to make the argument, which I did in a book I wrote called The Trouble with Democracy. And if you'll pardon the flagrant self-promotion, I do really recommend that book to your listeners. There's a chapter, a couple of chapters in particular. One is on Gnosticism and the longing for perfection, which is part of the Gnostic religion. So let me just talk a little bit about modern Gnosticism then, which really got a kick in the butt after Christianity got off the ground. And you could say it was a reaction to Christianity in the first 2 centuries of the Christian religion in particular, which is where a lot of its activity took place. And a lot of its so-called gospels were written and buried and later discovered. I think 1948 was the Nag Hammadi cache of documents was discovered. And the Gnostic Gospels were discovered. I forget the acts, wherever the Essenes were hanging out in Israel. So there was a lot going on after the Christian religion became active in the Middle East. There was also Mani. Mani was, we call him a Manichaean after his name. He was a religious prophet who preached, and by the way, Manichaeism, whatever, I don't know how you pronounce it, really was very widespread in European nations for about 1,000 years before it kind of died off. And Mani preached the idea that good and evil, they're different gods, the God of goodness, the God of evil, and they're in this kind of competition to the death here on earth. And St. Augustine got very wrapped up in this notion. And in his Confessions, which is one of the most wonderful little books you're ever going to want to read, boy, what a great voice comes through in that work. It was in that book where he kind of tells us that he decided to switch over to Christianity, thanks to his mother's persuasion, by the way, because he said it was false, the idea that there was a God of evil, that evil doesn't need a God. Evil is just the absence of the good. Now, this is intellectually and morally a fascinating concept, that evil is the absence of the good. It doesn't need personification, at least poetically, figuratively, or theoretically. And that's what pulled him into the Christian religion. And we all know he wrote his famous works after his conversion. I should also mention, and I'll get to this topic a little later, because it overlaps with Gnosticism, what I'm going to call millenarianism. Well, what is called millenarianism. This is a book by Norman Cohn called The Pursuit of the Millennium, Revolutionary Millenarians and the Mystical Anarchists of the Middle Ages. It's also a wonderful book. Don't get started unless you have some time, because you won't want to put it down. It's just full of the most unbelievable history and stories about us, basically, about the European civilization and how it came to be, and about the extraordinary religious and theological battles that took place for hundreds and hundreds of years, mostly in the European continent. Thousands of pilgrims marching across Europe, declaring the end of the world or the kingdom of heaven to come, and killing lots of people in the process, slaughtering them. Fascinating stories, and I think in reading these books, you get a certain sense of how all this works, which is what I'm going to talk about in a moment. The last book I want to recommend to your listeners is by a man named Ioan Culianu. He's a Romanian by origin. It's called The Tree of Gnosis. And it's more of a structural analysis of the religion, in which he kind of shows how it worked and the various subtypes of Gnosticism, which we're not going to be concerned about today, but also quite a fascinating book. And all these books talk to each other, and these scholars know each other and refer to each other's works. So let me just say that, what does Gnosticism, the word, come from, and what does it mean? Well, it comes from the word gnosis, Latin word gnosis, which has to do with knowledge. And the basic idea is that gnosis is has to do with a theological worldview, the idea of developing esoteric inner knowledge. And at that point, it's about the salvation for all who know. Who know what? Well, who have inner knowledge of the one true God. And so now I want to talk about that. Because I mentioned the word theodicy. I personally believe that almost every theological crisis in the modern world comes about through a struggle with theodicy. And theodicy is a word composed of the Greek word theos, meaning God, and dike, meaning justice. So it has to do with basically answering the question, which is fundamental to everyone. I can remember walking in dark streets at night with my pipe, which my dad gave me, because he didn't want me to smoke cigarettes. He said, "Here, those are terrible. Here's a pipe." So I used to, after my PhD studies, I used to go out with my pipe and walk on the streets, looking up at the sky, looking up at the stars, and wondering what all this was about and how did it come to be. And, I had the feeling that Pascal had. When Pascal looked up at the stars, he said something, and I'll give you the French first. He said, c'est le silence infini c'est le silence éternel de ces espaces infinis qui m'effraient. And what that means is, he said, it's the eternal silence of these infinite spaces that frightens me. It wasn't the infinite spaces that frightened him. It was the silence. Why? Because there was no voice. God was not talking to him, even though he felt he found God in his own way. When he walked at night like me and looked up at the stars, he was basically asking the theodicy question. How can there be a good God and a bad world? And what is the answer to that question? Every human being has to ask themselves the question and has to come to some kind of answer before they die. And I don't think it's good enough just to say, like a lot of people I know do, they just say, well, hell, there is no God. I'm an atheist. It's all Darwin. It's all physics, whatever, that kind of stuff. because even a child can answer them with the further question. Yeah, but how did Darwin come to be, and how did physics come to be? Why are there laws of the universe that we now know a lot about? At that point, they go drink with someone else. Just like that guy I told you about, who said, well, it's true for you, but not true for me. When I said, well, one of us must be wrong, he didn't want to debate it. This is true of most atheists too. They won't really go to all the way to the bottom to try to answer these questions. So anyway, that is the main question. How can there be a good God and a bad world? Well, there have been two main answers to that question, in my view, in modernity. Well, there were also the two main answers in ancient times. One of the answers is the Christian solution to this question. And there are other religious solutions which are like the Christian one, but I don't want to go too far afield. The Christian solution is that the combination of a bad man and a good world. Man is basically bad. The world is good. God's creation is good. But man is bad. And how did he get bad? Well, he fell in the Garden of Eden. He ate the apple. Eve ate the apple. Man became sinful. What's the corresponding salvation for that position? That really theological position is that man has free will, that man can do evil things or he can do good things. Clearly and obviously, if everyone did good things, there would be no evil in the world. There would be no terrible slaughters, terrible wars, terrible cruelty. All those things would disappear. Now, there would still be natural disasters, like, hurricanes, floods, all these terrible things that cause us grief. But most of those are not caused by human beings. So the Christian answer is pretty good, philosophically and theologically speaking. It's about a bad man and a good world. But the Gnostics in the day didn't like that solution. And I'm just paraphrasing, but what they said to each other was, that's a lot of BS about a bad man and a good world. Why are we bad? We're not bad by nature. A good God, there must be a good God somewhere, would not make us bad by nature. So their answer to the problem was not optimism like the Christians, but pessimism. What they said was, we are good men in a bad world. You see, just the flip of the Christian solution to the great theodicy question. They said, we are good men in a bad world. Now, this gets a little tricky, and I don't want to get too involved here. But Hans Jonas, in his wonderful book on the Gnostic religion, deals with this to a great extent. And at the end of his book, he talks about the similarity between this position and modern existentialism. Modern existentialism, basically, a la Jean-Paul Sartre and other philosophers, which I can come back to, basically deals with the idea that it's a bad world. It's a meaningless world. We have to create our own meaning, give ourselves, his basic idea was that existence precedes essence, which a lot of other philosophers like the great Etienne Gilson says was nonsense, but Sartre got away with it. Why was it nonsense? Because obviously we are born men. We are not born horses or peacocks or turtles. A man has an essence. A peacock and a turtle have an essence. So we don't choose our essence. We can't say that existence precedes essence. We're born with an essence, and that's how we are defined in the great scheme of things. But unfortunately, Sartre and Gilson never got to debate each other, which they could have. They were alive at the same time. At any rate, in Jonas's book, he tries to draw the parallel between this very pessimistic Gnostic worldview and modern existentialism. But I think the difference is this. In modern existentialism, there is no meaning beyond the terrible world that we're stuck in and the good man that existentialists want us to make of ourselves through free choice. A term, by the way, which has all but polluted modernity. The idea that to choose something makes it good is one of the most foolish of all philosophical positions, but we see it everywhere, especially in unsophisticated philosophers and students and feminists and so on who, like, for example, the woman who says it's my body, my choice. If I choose to kill my child, that makes it good. Gilson, of course, couldn't accept that kind of position, and neither can I. I think the idea that choice makes anything good is obviously false, because any human being can choose bad things. Choice has nothing to do with goodness. The question is, are you choosing the good or the bad, or something in between? At any rate, let's be clear now on the difference between the Christian solution to the theodicy problem and the Gnostic solution. Again, the Christians was optimistic. We are bad men, fallen men, sinful men. We need salvation, etc. But we're in a good world. The world that God created was a good world. And the Gnostic turns around and says, that's nonsense. It's obviously a bad world. It's a terrible place to live. It's full of evil. And we are good by nature. And by the way, get that phrase. We are good by nature. We see that in the work of quasi-modern philosophers like Rousseau. His whole social contract philosophy rests on the single idea that we are good by nature, and social convention and society makes us bad. We become ruined by these things. But in our own selves, we are good by nature. So the Gnostic view has persisted throughout time, and it surfaces again and again in various modern philosophers. He's one of them, and there are many around today. Let me just digress by saying that yesterday, the legislature in my province of Ontario passed a law, I think it's called Bill C4 or something, in which they declared it illegal to offer transition treatment to anyone who believes that they're some other gender than the one they were born with. Here's the law, which is resting on the notion of natural goodness, that that whatever you say, and choice, that whatever you say you are is what you are. It's the most bizarre thing anyone has ever seen, almost all of human history. It's even more bizarre than what some of those people back in ancient times were doing, you see. Because obviously, if you think you're Napoleon, as I said on our last talk, you're not Napoleon. And just because you think you're a boy, if you're born female, doesn't make you a boy. But this law, this is shocking actually, this law basically is threatening therapists with 5 years in jail if they actually offer to treat someone with transition therapy, denying what it is they have said about their gender. I find it absolutely astonishing and appalling. I don't think it'll last, that law. It's got to get shot down at some point for the kind of reason that I have spelled out. At any rate, I think the Gnostic religion, the idea of this terrible pessimism about the world, and the idea that man is good by nature, which is a fundamentally Gnostic view, it's my expression, I guess, is the great shadow religion of the Western world. I call it the shadow religion because it never goes away. It's always shadowing these other explanations for how we got to where we are. Now, what does the Gnostic actually think about his existence then, as compared, say, to the modern existentialist who doesn't think anything except he's free to choose his own essence? And he makes that up by way of the choices that he has to stand behind. What the Gnostic believes is that the world is bad. This mundane place is bad. Mundane being the root of the Latin word mundus, for earth. This mundane world is bad, but there is a true God. There is a pure, wonderful, beautiful, spiritually adorable God beyond this realm, extra mundane God, and he exists. It's still a he, even back then. In what they call the pleroma. That's just a word they use to describe this spiritual realm belong the prison of this earth in which they felt that they were trapped. And think of the ring of that with what I just told you about these people who talk about being trapped in their bodies. Today, right down in Toronto where I live, people going to therapists saying, well, I was born a girl, but I'm a guy. I'm trapped in this girl's body. Please help me get out. That's not very far at all from what the Gnostics were arguing in a much broader sense. They had great appeal at the time. But they weren't like modern existentialists. They were pessimistic with respect to this world, but they were not pessimistic with respect to their own final end, in which they would find spiritual happiness. How? Through knowledge. Knowledge. If they could just understand the framework of what I'm telling you, they would then become a knower, or what they refer to themselves as pneumatics. A pneumatic is another or pneuma, a Latin word having to do with spirit or air. And of course, even in the English language, the word spirit has this connotation. We talk about people being inspired, for example, as if the air has come into them, the air of the soul or the spirit, some kind of spirit is in them. They're inspired people. We talk about inspiration and things like that. Anyway, what the Gnostics said was that there is a truth, it's just not here. We are trapped in this earth, we are trapped in our bodies. And by the way, this leads me to say that for many of these Gnostics, their reaction to their own bodies and to procreation was varied. And Culiano talks about this in the Tree of Gnosis book I showed you, in which he describes some branches of Gnosticism which were completely libertine. Their idea was that this earth is such an evil place and nothing means anything in it. The only thing that means something is the world I'm going to, where I will find pure spiritual bliss in the pleroma when I join the one true God. But as long as I'm trapped here, I'm going to indulge the hell out of myself. I'm going to have sex all the time. I'm going to drink my head off, party on down, until the end of time, and so on. But then there was the other type of Gnostic who felt so repelled by the physical world. Oh, and let me go back to the guy who's celebrating all of this because he thinks he's a pure Gnostic spirit, and he's going to indulge himself. In the 17th century, there were a lot of millenarians running around England who actually infested the military body of what's called the New Model Army, which my friend Ian Gentles has just written a wonderful book about. And a lot of them were running around with this idea that they were not only pure in spirit, but their purity would positively affect others. And there was one feller, I think his name was Ebenezer Kopp, I hope I got the right guy, and he actually told all the women that he met that if they made love with him, they would be virgins again. So I thought that was a pretty interesting sexual advertising program for some guy to run around with, making every woman he slept with a new virgin. But he wasn't kidding. He actually felt that they would be purified by their contact with him. You see, but essentially what he was doing was exhausting his own body, his own physical appetites, and his own self. So instead of repudiating it all, it was like super overindulgence. But both these things are forms of repudiation. They're both saying this world is a useless place. It has no value. I'm trapped in it. And I know that, which makes me a Gnostic. And I can't wait to get out of this evil place and join the one true God in the pleroma when I die. Now, I don't know if it was Toronto, but it was someplace in North America not long ago. I read a story about a sect of Gnostic men who felt so repugnant, repulsed by their own bodies and by the world they were forced to live in with those bodies. They castrated themselves because reproduction is strictly a no-no. No true Gnostic of that ascetic type is ever going to procreate. They feel if you have children, you're just taking part in this horrible world. You're perpetuating it. Why would you do that? So they castrated themselves, and then they poisoned themselves so that they could go take their journey to their one true God. Now, it's you can mock that all you want, But you can't say they didn't have a love of their one true God, a deep spiritual love of their one true God. You can say it was false, that it was silly, that it was wasteful, that it was against, say, the Christ concept of the Christian or the Jewish or the Islamic God or whatever. But you can't say they weren't serious. People don't castrate themselves like that if they're not serious about their spiritual convictions, which is what they were. So this was anti-biology. And again, I'm making the leap to modern times and saying we're living in an anti-biological age. And that criminalizing that transitioning process of therapy is part of that. 5 years in jail. So anyway, I'm just running along here, but I did want to say that the escape from the trap for the Gnostic was connection with the one true God. First, the spiritual connection, and then the actual spiritual voyage. And there's a bunch of Americans running around with license plates and stickers on the back of their cars. I forget what sect they belong to. They're actually Christians, born agains. But on the sticker in the back of the bumper, it says, "Beam me up, Lord." Well, beam me up means, get me up there with you. I can't wait. That's the sort of overlapping theme that I'm getting at here. So that's all I want to say right now about Gnosticism and what that's about. And I want to move over now to a kind of sister idea, which is found in Millenarianism. And because that rose in parallel with Gnosticism and, in a sense, against it. Millenarianism really got its root in the Gospel of John, in the New Testament, Book of Revelation, and so on, where there's a promise of the idea that the world is evil, that there's a Messiah to come that will transform this world, bringing us a new world order, and that the job of the millenarian at that point is to eliminate all non-believers and heretics, which is a familiar story in European history. Norman Cohn, I showed you his book, wrote The Pursuit of the Millennium. It's about the rise of millenarianism, about all these prophets who were raging across Europe for 1,000 years, especially in the kind of period of the Crusades and maybe up until the almost 1800s, amassing thousands and thousands of followers for their visions of the perfect spiritual community, and the idea that the kingdom of heaven was yet to come. Now, there are many kinds of millenarians too. Some of them believe that the kingdom of heaven came with Christ when he first came to earth. Others believe that that wasn't the case, that it's yet to come when Christ comes again. And so, millenarianism is formed of two words, Latin mille for 1,000, and annus, which means year. So the 1,000-year reign of Christ, or whoever the Savior is going to be, which would happen when the millennium arrives. And of course, there's all kinds of people speculating on what date that might happen. But I would say, again, I'm just leaning on the scholars themselves, probably the most influential millenarian thinker in the European tradition was a man named Joachim of Fiora, or Flora. It was basically a town in Italy. He was a 12th century monk who had a specific belief which kind of infected a lot of people, right up to Adolf Hitler, by the way, and you'll see why in a minute. He had a three-part scheme. He believed that all of human history, and for him, the only history that mattered was theological history, could be broken into the periods of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The period of the Father was the period of law and patriarchy, the law of Moses in the Jewish and Christian tradition, was the first stage. And all that was well and good. But the second stage came with the arrival of Christ and the Christian church and the bureaucracy of the church and all those kinds of things, which he didn't like. But the last stage, which is not here yet, was a stage of spiritual bliss, in which free spirits would reign over the earth. And he called this the third kingdom. Now, it so happens that the German word for kingdom is the word Reich. And you won't be surprised if I tell you that I think the whole Hitler movement was affected by Joachim's philosophy, which is why he called his dream society the Third Reich. So anyway, what happens when this millenarianism comes up into the modern period? Well, there's a fellow named James Rhodes, Rhodes, who wrote a book called The Hitler Movement, which was published in 1980 by Stanford University, where I went to school. And the basic theme of the book is that the Hitler movement was a millenarian movement. Hitler was the dreamed of leader I told you about. He was promising the kingdom of heaven on earth in the third millennium, which he was bringing about. And that philosophy, ancient though it was, 12th century really, is what infected millions of Germans and millions of Nazis who joined his movement. Again, this was a kind of, it required a sort of death of God, secularism, spiritual pessimism, and so on, but not in these movements. They injected hope. In fact, in my book, The Trouble with Democracy, I call the millenarian movements the hope dope of the West. It was something that was being injected into Western intellectuals by way of promises of the kingdom to come. And I think I mentioned in one of our sessions, the Soviet marshal, I forget his name, Shukov, whoever he was actually interviewed by Time magazine when the Soviet Union fell. Now, the Soviet Union and all Marxism, all communism, are millenarian movements. In a moment, I'm going to tell you why they're different from Gnostic movements. But they're millenarian movements which are promising the kingdom of heaven. And when Time magazine interviewed this Russian general after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and all the rest of it, the thing fell apart so fast, it was unbelievable. He basically said, what the hell were you doing? What were you people doing over there? And why were you liquidating millions of your own citizens in order to do it? And you know what he said? And I'm quoting. He said, the kingdom of heaven on earth before the third millennium. Those were this general's exact words. You couldn't get it out of a textbook. Anything more clear than that. So I think now I've given you kind of a run through Gnosticism, which was fundamentally pessimistic about life on this earth, although it did imagine a blissful, wonderful existence when you became a pure spirit and left this earth to join the one true God beyond this terrible place. And millenarianism, which had to do with the creation of the kingdom of heaven on this earth. Now, how does all that intersect with at least my analysis of modern politics? Well, it's not original with me, but there's something called the secularization thesis. And this is the idea that millenarianism in particular, which has its own kind of Gnostic element, got secularized. In other words, political theorists started creating theories of political perfection, how to bring political perfection to this world, but without God, without anybody in the pleroma like the Gnostics believe, and in a purely secular way, atheistic way, materialistic way, the idea was that human reality could be engineered to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth without God and without any theological implications whatsoever. In other words, a lot of these thinkers began to believe that man could be perfected. Human beings could become perfect. And then the theodicy question would no longer be an issue, because you wouldn't have to say good man, bad world, or bad world, good man. You could say good man, good world, because we're making it good and we're making you good by basically educating you about what's good and what's not, and providing you through the tax system and the political system with equal outcomes of a good nature, of equal and good nature. So you'll all be good citizens. So that's kind of in the background. Well, at this point, I began to say to myself, where are some of the best analyses of this political reality, this transformation of millenarianism and Gnosticism into modern, what people have called political religions? Now, it's not a wasted phrase. These things have become political religions. Now, how can you have a political religion without a God? Well, perhaps it's a bit loose, but the idea is that they are political and they are religious because they are preached. And they are preached as the salvation of man on this earth. And one of the great analysts of this tendency was a man named Eric Voegelin. Now, I'm no Voegelin scholar, but I've done a little bit of reading about him. He was a professor at Stanford when I was there, and he died after the year after I arrived, not because of me, by the way, and I wish I'd met him. He was more or less uncelebrated in the media because he was such a conservative thinker, and anybody who's awake, especially who's woke, will know that conservatives are not getting celebrated these days. But he was intensely interesting man who wrote copiously about political life. And one of his books was called The New Science of Politics, in which he explained that in his view, the Gnostic religion had got secularized and was the cause of all these modern political religions like Marxism, Nazism, Fascism, and Communism, and so on. That it was the secularization of Gnosticism. When I read this, I read him, and I'm taking you on a personal adventure now. I began to think a lot about what he argued, and something began to niggle at me when I said to myself, could someone as bright and well-read as Voegelin been wrong about this? Could he have been putting his finger on the wrong villain here when he fingered Gnosticism? Now, why did I ask myself that question? Well, it's because Gnosticism was so damn pessimistic. You see, it was about no hope. What the ancients called contemptus mundi, the contempt for the whole world. There is no salvation. It's not possible. If there is any salvation, it's way beyond here. You got to get out of here to find it. So how could the secularization of that idea be the cause of political religions, which were in fact trying to gerrymander the world we live in and make it, the perfect political system? Didn't seem to make sense. So I got on the internet, which, this is 25 years ago, which was fairly new at the time. And I found a man named Ellis Sandoz, Sandoz. And he was the head of the Eric Voegelin Society. So I thought, what the heck, Bill? Write the guy and tell him your concern. So I wrote to him and I said, and this was very bold of me. He obviously loves Eric Voegelin, so I don't know what I was doing, but my professor friend used to say, l'audace, toujours l'audace, even if you're going to be wrong, speak up. So I said to Ellis Sandoz, I think Voegelin was wrong. Well, he could have just shut me down, but he actually wrote me back. What do you mean Voegelin was wrong, and so on? So I told him what I'm telling you right now, that I think he fingered the wrong culprit. I think it was secularized millenarianism that was the culprit, not Gnosticism, which wanted nothing to do with this world and was completely pessimistic, whereas millenarianism is completely optimistic. It's all about re-engineering reality to make it better, actually, to make it perfect. And wouldn't you know that in the Middle Ages of European life, there were people called parfaits, which is a strange pronunciation of the word perfect. People who considered themselves perfect because they had these spiritual and millenarian beliefs about converting this world into the kingdom of God. And lots of them had communities and tried that. Most of them failed, but they did try. Anyway, I had this back and forth with Ellis Standos that went on for 2 weeks, maybe more. And I still have the documents in my library because I copied them all. But after a point, he said, you know what? He said, the Eric Voegelin Society, he said, is meeting in Boston in 2 weeks. He said, I think I can make 10 minutes for you. Why don't you come down and present a 10-minute lecture if you can fit your idea into a 10-minute lecture? So I said, well, I'd be honored. Thank you. That would be a new experience. So I got in the airplane and I went to Boston, and I showed up for the meeting with about 20 copies of my paper for anybody who wanted them. And I gave my little talk. And I don't know whether they were convinced or not, but at the end of the talk, this paper flew off the desk like a flock of white pigeons, and they seemed happy with it. And it got published in a journal called Modern Age. So if you want to read the paper, which is a very compressed form of what I'm telling you now, it's a short paper. It's only 10 minutes because that's all I got. So I had to really, really compress this argument into about 7 or 8 pages. At any rate, you can find it on my website, williamgairdner.ca. You just open the website, you click essays, and when the essays open, and there's a few there I think you might enjoy, you'll find one called Hyper-Democracy and the Gnostic Impulse. It was also reprinted in a journal called Modern Age. And if you go to Modern Age, which is published by the Institute, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and just search my name, the essay will pop up and you can reprint it from there. And I shouldn't get into any more flagrant self-promotion, but the editor of the journal wrote me to say it was the best essay on Voegelin he'd ever read, which may just mean I was wrong and so was he. I don't know. But anyway, he liked it, and I recommend it to you for sure, to get the very compressed form of what I'm telling you today. At any rate, what was the gist of the essay? Well, it was the argument that modernity, especially modern democracy, is in fact a mixture of optimistic millenarian philosophy combined with pessimistic Gnostic philosophy. The optimistic millenarianism is found in the elites of all the Western democracies. People paid more than most people for the same work in the free market. People who are flooding our airports with their nice suits and dresses and their black valises and all that kind of thing that they're carrying around, full of their notes for how they're going to re-engineer our society and perfect it. And my argument in the paper and right now is that optimistic millenarian group of elites, and there's millions of them. I found out yesterday when I did the research that Canada, for example, I was asking how many government workers there are in Canada. The figure was just under 5 million for a country of 32 million people. To have 5 million government workers. Now, I know some of them are, doing whatever, taking out the garbage, but a lot of them are these millenarian type elites who are working like crazy to perfect our society, just like optimistic millenarians did back in the day. But what they require to make this work is a massive pessimistic Gnostic mass of people who are, let me go through it again. The millenarian group has to be optimistic. They believe in a new world order. Think of some of the names they give to their political programs. Pierre Trudeau, the father of our present prime minister, referred to Canada as the just society. That's what he wanted to bring about. I forget, I don't know what, Biden's phrase he's using for America now, something about build back better. See the word better, we're going to make you better, right? It's our job to make you better and all that. And, and Trump did the same thing, make America great again. At least he agreed that they had been great, and now he wants to make them great again. Maybe he wasn't trying to impose a different or better revolution on them than just asking them to get back to where they were. At any rate, that first level of elites, optimism, the new idea of the new world order, that's a phrase that we see again and again in these international groups that are hip-hopping around on their gas-guzzling private jets all over the world, trying to plan the new world order for us. They're interested in the destruction of the present, destroying the world that we have and the way it is, even to the extent of, destroying engines like capitalism, free enterprise. These are some of the most radical of them, I agree, but they're all over America right now, this gang of 5 or 6, whatever they're called, mostly women, who are Marxist in their orientation, who want to destroy America the way it is. Same is true with environmentalists of this millenarian nature. They want to save the world, make a new world order, change the system and the structure. They're also all secularists for the most part. Very few of them are religious people. It's a secular kingdom they want to bring about, and they want it to be egalitarian. Okay, now they're hyped up on this stuff. They're totally motivated. They go to work every day just dying to make that happen. Now, who and what is the object of their manipulation? Well, it's basically you and me. It's the more or less, not always true, of course, but more or less atheistic, materialistic, pessimistic, passive masses who are willingly accepting this vision, the millenarian vision for themselves, which is going to be downloaded on them and change their life. You see, so what I'm arguing in the paper is that these two realms of reality require each other. The indolent masses actually require these revolutionary elites, or nothing happens, nothing moves at all. And the revolutionary elites absolutely require us as ignorant masses that they can manipulate. So I'm going to finish up by saying that, and it's just a quote from my book, The Trouble with Democracy, which, as I say, I encourage you to read. It's a very involved, but I'm not going to say difficult book if you actually follow the arguments, but it's very involved, and it shows you how these things are woven together to get where they are today. So what I said there on page 88 was, quote, that the modern democracies, and I now call them hyper-democracies, seem to require for their success and survival a deeply pessimistic and passive public, obedient to optimistic utopian leaders. And then again, quote, these two zones are interdependent realms that feed on each other to survive, unquote. And then to finish up, one more quote, I write that the modern secular democracies have become the political expression of a Gnostic people in thrall to secular militarian elites. So anyway, that's the story from my point of view of the rise of modern Gnosticism and how it's in sync with a secularized militarian reality that has been shaping the modern democracies, really you could say for the last 100 years, but certainly vigorously for the last 50 years. So I've gone for almost an hour now, nonstop. I apologize.
No, that was a beautiful presentation. Thank you so much for the information. I just want to ask if you find that the millenarians, I can't pronounce it properly, forgive me, do you see like a connection to Marxism or communism? Do you see that philosophy slash theology connecting to those movements as well?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I mentioned the interview with Time Magazine and the Russian general. Time Magazine could not understand what I'm talking about because they never thought about it or put it to themselves that way. But when he asked the general, basically, what were you doing for those 75 years existence of the Soviet Union? He answered very frankly. He said that we were trying to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth before the third millennium. His phrase, I'm quoting him directly, how could you find a more explicit expression of a political religion in our time than that? So the answer to your question is, it was very conscious. It was done with full knowledge of the revolutionary nature of this thing. And by the way, that's why the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, didn't allow other parties. It's also why China doesn't allow other parties to compete with this vision, because they feel there's only one right way. And logically, they would say, there must be only one right way. How could there be more than one right way to do it right? So their thinking was, we've got the answer. We know the right way. And you can choose different leaders and we can have elections about who's going to get us there better than the next guy if you want. But we're not going to let you choose for alternative visions. For example, for a Western free enterprise, family-based open society vision. We're not going to do that because clearly that's not the right way. They're a mess and we're not, is what they were thinking. So that's the only answer I can give you to that question.
Thank you. Do you also recognize any kind of link to the Jesuit order?
I'm pardon me?
I'm asking if you found any connections between the Gnostics or the Millenarium and the Jesuit movement order.
I don't know enough about the Jesuit order, but I think there's a great deal of Gnosticism in the Christian religion, for sure. And there's a great deal of debate and argument about what are called the Gnostic Gospels, which were dug up at Nag Hammadi and other sites in the Holy Land, from which it becomes obvious. I mean, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that this is what the church fathers, for example, at their initial meetings to decide upon the Christian canon, like what would be in the Bible and what would not be in the Bible. These are the kind of things they had arguments about, that those Gnostic Gospels must be false, they couldn't be true, and the Gnostic sayings of Jesus got left out of the Bible, and their argument was they weren't his sayings, they were fake. But I don't know enough about this to say whether or not Jesus actually did say any of those things or not. But I can tell you that if you want to find them, you can just go online and look them up. Books have been published on the Gnostic sayings of Jesus. Well, the church was pretty adamant about cleansing itself of any, let's call it counter-theology or counter-theological statements. And that's what it was doing in the Middle Ages. Last time we were together, I spoke about a book called Montaillou, Montaillou, which is a town or region in the south of France, centered around the town of Albi, where the Albigensians lived. And they were Gnostic people. There must have been 300 or 400 of them. A lot of them got burned at the stake by the Inquisition for their beliefs in Gnosticism. And the record that they left in their testimony, which is what the book is mostly about, what kinds of people were they, what kinds of life, especially family life, did they have. But the Albigensians were adamantly Gnostic. They basically said, you Christians are way off. You're not correct. It's a lie you've been told. And I have no idea whether they had access to any of the Gnostic writings or not. I doubt it, because they were dug up in the desert, in this last century. But nevertheless, you can find a lot of elements of Gnosticism in the Christian religion today. So my friend Scotty, for example, who walks around believing that he's walking with Christ, that Christ is somehow within him as a spark. Now, the word spark is often found in the Christian religion and maybe in Judaism too, I don't know, and in Islam. I've done a bit of reading on Islam too. Its history is also quite fascinating. In fact, I think I mentioned to you, did I, last time, that one of my relatives wrote a famous book on Islam called The Reproach of Islam, in which he gives a very in-depth analysis of how it works. But at any rate, this idea of the light within is all through the Christianity and many other religions. Now that makes sense because it's an easy symbol, to be enlightened. In fact, when I was a young boy, I was sent off to a boys' boarding school, and I never went back home for any long period of time. I was 10 years old. And when I was sitting on my bed in this dormitory, there was a dormitory where 25 of us were all sleeping. We didn't have our own rooms or anything. I'm sitting on my bed, and the choir master came by, and he plunked himself down in the end of my bed, and he said, "I want you to sing." And I said, "Pardon me?" And he said, "I want you to sing what I'm going to sing." And he began to sing a rather difficult little piece called "Lighten Our Darkness, We Beseech Thee, O Lord." And if I wasn't so old, I would sing it for you. So I sang it pretty well right after him. And he pointed to me, he said, "You're going to be in the choir." And I was in that choir for the next 8 years of my life as a soloist. At any rate, I'm only pointing you to it because of the phrase, "lighten our darkness." So the idea of Gnosticism is that the pneuma, or the spark, which falls into this earth and is caught by the true Gnostic as a form of knowledge within his very being, is not that different from my friend Scotty, who says that the Spirit of Christ is within him, and he talks about himself as being saved. Now, he's a good friend, but he implies that I'm not saved because I'm not of his faith exactly. And of course, my wife, he's a good friend, so we laugh about it, but my wife turns to him and she says, "I thought only God knew who was saved, Scotty." And we changed the subject. But the reason I raise it is because of the parallel with the Gnostic spark. It's all through Christianity. And I can't do it here, but if I took the time, I could dig up for you lots of Gnostic elements in that religion. And I'm sure it's in Judaism too. I think I'm sure. And of course, in Judaism, you have the hope of the kingdom to come. The Messiah is not here yet. In Christianity, he's already come and he's coming again, and all that kind of thing. But that's the millenarian aspect of both these religions. Perfection is in the future. And when this thing gets secularized, watch out, because then you're talking about secular millenarian politicians and a political religion. And this is what happened in the French Revolution. It was sparked and motivated by the Enlightenment philosophy of rationalism. And the new god of the religion was the goddess of reason, whom I mentioned last time, of whom a 35-foot papier-mâché statue was made. And Christ was taken out of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The altar was smashed and destroyed. Her statue was mounted up where the altar used to be. And these philosophers, not priests, but secular philosophers, were marching around the statue with their white robes and their candles, chanting all kinds of phrases from Diderot and Rousseau in particular, whose book, The Social Contract, became their new Bible. And when Robespierre went to the guillotine, which must have upset him a little bit because he was the big instigator of the revolution that killed him, he was clutching Rousseau's book, The Social Contract, to his breast, just like a Bible. And it was his secular Bible. And that's how he tried to restructure, how the French tried to restructure all of France, which is a whole other topic, but it's kind of my answer to your question. Sorry to go on so long.
Thank you very much, William. Your information is incredible, and the way you deliver it, it's so clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was wondering if we can bring in Lloyd for a few minutes, if that's okay with you, just to make the connection to Gnosticism and Islam.
Yeah, I'm
Would you
sorry.
like?
I should have invited him in. I didn't mean to speak so long.
No, no, that's your show. I just want to make the connection for the sake of our audience. So,
I want to hear it.
okay, Lloyd, can you please come? Lloyd,
Hi there. Hi,
welcome, Lloyd.
William. Hi, William. I'm
Hello.
Lloyd. Hi there, William. I'm Lloyd. I'm South African. I live in Poland, though, in Warsaw. Good to meet you.
You too.
Thank you for your talk. Fascinating. My expertise is Islam, most specifically a focus on Islamic law, which is very little known outside the realm of the major Islamic scholars. And when you read through the major work on Islamic, or the most popular work on Islamic law, the Sharia, as they call it in the fiqh, is called the Umdat al-Salik. A much longer name, but typically just called the Reliance of the Traveler. It explicitly states within the Islamic law, and you can go through numerous different scholars' works, you can go through numerous major works of Islamic law. They state quite explicitly that Islam is a Gnostic religion, that the scholars are Gnostics. For instance, in one of the rulings on the ijma is the consensus of the scholars. This is what they all have agreed upon, and this forms the foundation of Islamic belief. And one of the rulings is that this world and what is in it are accursed. So within Islam, Islam also teaches that the world is a cursed place, which is exactly the inversion of the Christian belief that the world is good.
Yes.
And and you'll find numerous specific and explicit mentions of Gnosticism within Islam. And then another interesting point is that Islam, you mentioned political religions, with the requirement for ignorance. And in fact, within Islamic law, without doing an entire lecture on Islamic law, but it states that Islam has 4 levels. The lowest level is the Ibadah. Then you have, which is the plain, Ibadah, Ishara, Lataif, and the Haqa'iq. So the upper levels are reserved exclusively for the major scholars, the elect, as they call them, the elite scholars. Most Muslims, the overwhelming majority, fall into what's called the Ibadah level, which is the level for the exoteric, what is Islam for the masses, as they term it, Islam for the masses. They're required simply to follow the rules and to have the least possible knowledge. In fact, when you read the Islamic law, and I've done it on the shows, Muslims are required to be ignorant with complete faith and complete,
Complicity. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a word I'm missing here, but they need to be completely certain. Complete certainty, total certainty, yet without knowledge. Right? This is one of the regulations within the Islamic law. And so you've got these levels, you've got these scholars, and so the first 2 levels are just rules and regulations, but also Islam calls itself a deen. Now, we term it religion because it's a convenience. However, Islam, within its doctrines of deception, and it has detailed and extensive doctrines of deception and lying, they state that ignorance can serve the benefit of Islam. So, but deen, what Islam calls itself, has 4 meanings. The first meaning is subjugation, dominance, administrative and legislative authority, to put pressure to be obedient, using power to enslave and make obedient, and obedience and bondage, subordination and domination, and bearing humiliation under subjugation and power of others. It says deen does not mean religion, it means obedience.
Could I comment?
Certainly, yeah. I'll pause there.
Thank you for that. It's a lot at once, and I'm afraid I'm not an expert at it. Although, as I say, I've been quite interested in this subject for some years, especially since 9/11.
Yeah.
At any rate, I have a little difficulty understanding why it would be termed Gnostic if the emphasis is on ignorance in the believer, whereas in the Gnostic, the emphasis is on pure knowledge and empathy, even sympathy with the pure God outside this world. And so it would seem a little different to me. It seems to me it almost reflects what I was talking about earlier. What we're doing politically in the West now, which is these elites who do have the knowledge, or think they do, requiring a kind of ignorant mass of voters and people who will be manipulated in order to bring about the secular kingdom of heaven on earth.
Well,
I don't know quite how that fits with what you're telling me.
On that, so this would be I'll try and be brief. Islam has adopted ideas from Judaism, ideas from Christianity, ideas from Gnosticism, especially Manichaeism, glommed them together and made its own little modifications. Aside from that point, Islam believes that it came to address the condition of ignorance that man was in prior to the arrival of Islam. What they call the jahiliyyah, the condition of ignorance. People refer to it as the time of ignorance, but really it's the condition of ignorance that we're in. And Islam brings the sacred knowledge, the secret knowledge. And now the lay masses are not required to know, they're required to obey. Prayer is what they call fard al-kifaya, a communal obligation, which is done by the elect, the elite scholars, the top scholars. And those scholars do the spiritual intercession on behalf of the masses, and they're the only ones required to do this. The rest are simply required to obey.
And the word Islam means submission, doesn't it?
Correct. And also another point, I'll end here, and you can then comment. You mentioned the Nazis. Now there's a curious case of a man called Baron Rudolf von Sebottendorf. He was a known Freemason and a practitioner of alchemy. He moved to Turkey, where he joined an Islamic family. He stayed with them. He was inducted into Rosicrucian beliefs. He joined the Masonic Lodge, etc. However, in 1910, he founded a lodge of the Bektashi Sufi order in Constantinople. Right? Then he returned to Germany, where he founded the Thule Society. The Thule Society became very popular, it drew a lot of people who then became part of the Nazi Party. But in about 1918, it became the German Workers' Party, the National Socialist Workers' Party, was joined in 1919 by Adolf Hitler, and then became the Nazi Party. So the Nazi Party has a direct link to this Islamic Sufism. Now, the Sufis do claim to be the original Freemasons, to have preserved Freemasonic knowledge that was lost by fake offshoot Western Freemasonry. And these are cultic ideas, because when you learn about Islam has two divisions, the Sharia, which is simply following the law, and then you've got the Hakika, which is the mystical aspect, denied to the masses exclusively for the elect. And all this occult knowledge is reserved for them, and he was teaching this in Germany at the time. I'll leave it at that.
Yes, interesting. There's a lot of information there, and it came a bit fast for me to absorb it all. But I get the picture, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if there were elements of Gnosticism in Sufism, which I think there are, and in Islam.
No, they claim to be explicitly Gnostic. They make no bones about
itself. But Allah. But perhaps we could agree that Allah is considered a good, almighty, and good, and
no. No, it's against the Islamic law to pigeonhole Allah into any category, because Allah must be able to do anything. He must be able to do evil.
I got that, but I don't think most Muslims walk around thinking that Allah is evil. They think of him as a God of will who can do evil if he wants to, or good if he wants to. But I doubt that my Muslim friends, I have a few, are walking around thinking that he's an evil force in the universe. Maybe we should leave it at there, and we can have another session on this sometime and explore it further. There's a book that interested me a lot. You're probably familiar with it, called The Closing of the Muslim Mind. Well, it's a very interesting book which gets into the medieval conflict between the Mutazilites and the Asherites, and Al-Ghazali and Averroes, who was 100 years later, and their conflict over the nature of God, which is anyway, it's really an interesting book and explains to some extent why it is that I think, I'm picking my numbers here, but I saw a study somewhere indicating that a country like Arabia, for example, issued something like 100 patents 2 years ago, whatever, and Israel issued about 100,000. And it was tracing, I'm picking the number again, But the idea was that these Christian nations are just filled with creativity and invention. And you can see that in the number of patents that they apply for every year. Whereas the Islamic countries have ended up being, except for the oil money, ended up being docile, intellectually and docile nations, which are not creative in the same sense that I just indicated. Anyway, I have to go have dinner now, but I want to thank you for your comments and thank Harry for allowing me to speak with you all again.
It's our pleasure. Thank you so much for coming, William. And we will be seeing you again next Wednesday and back to the family.
Back to the family, yes.
Yes,
Next
back
week,
to the
we'll
family.
talk about the philosophy of the anti-family tradition, which I describe gingerly, but in fact there is an anti-family tradition in the Western world which we need to understand because it's very active almost every Western country at this very moment. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you. See you next week, and thank you, Lloyd, for joining the conversation. I will open the floor for free conversation now. Thank you very much.